rats in my stomach growling. I had to take on cross. So, whether you already had lunch, having lunch, or waiting to have a late lunch, macro top. Guessing. Now studying. Back. You look at the statistics. Look at 2% happen through websites, out of which 44% have some. Thus, tells you that though cross-site scripting dropped a little bit, WASP scale of eminent vulnerabilities, it's still there. Since 2011, it's been featured consistently and now ranks at about number 6 or number 7. Now, typically when you look at solutions to cross-site scripting, you tend to look at them from a very technical perspective in terms of how do you actually practice your code. But when it comes to access management and cross-site scripting, I invite you to go and do a quick search online, and you won't see a lot where folks are looking at, let's look at access management and identity as a starting point for protecting against XSS scripting. More importantly, there are different variations of cross-site scripting, and in this session, we're going to present a challenge statement to a member from Cloudentity and understand how access management can help prevent against such attacks. Before I begin, not only do I want to thank the audience for joining us from all across the world, but I also want to acknowledge the fact that this conference happening online and virtually is also taking place on Indigenous grounds. The virtual space, the digital space, is also Indigenous land, and as you know very well, the cables through which our internet runs, the skies and the land are all Indigenous land. And I want to thank everyone for creating a safe space for sharing and a safe space for us to engage on securing our web infrastructure. So before I begin and dive into the challenge statement, I'm going to ask each of our panelists today to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start off with two of my fellow advisors first, before I go to the main man from Cloudentity. First, I'm going to start off with Captain Graeme Barrie, not too far away from where I am right now, a good friend, fellow advisor on siberXchange 3.0. Graeme, can you tell us why this subject of cross-site scripting is particularly important, and why does it have your level of interest? Graeme.
This one really piqued my interest, mainly years ago when I used to dabble on the technical side, doing cross-site scripting myself in a test environment. It was fascinating to me, but now when I'm working with clients, I'm coaching access management. Where's your data? Who has access to your data? And now the two are merging as things just become so connected with APIs. When I was first presented with the topic, I went down the rabbit hole researching, and the whole idea of access management with APIs and interconnectivity it just blew me away. Especially with a lot of the clients I'm working with right now, it's very timely. So it really got its claws into me, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I think, when you and I were talking about this, whether it's persistent or reflected types of attacks or other DOM-based attacks from an XSS standpoint, how systems have become intricately woven with each other really brings up the subject of how access management can play a role when we address cross-site scripting. So thank you, Graeme, for that. And I'm looking forward to some of the questions that you are going to raise. Now, Graeme, if I thought you were not too far away, one person who is definitely not far away and is a stone's throw away is Ketan, who also, if I'm not mistaken, lives in the town of Ajax. Ketan, welcome, and once again, thank you for all of your support and being a fellow advisor on siberXchange 3.0 Challenge Statement Edition. Ketan, why is this subject particularly important to you, and what are you looking forward to hearing about from the team at Cloudentity? Ketan.
I think like my fellow advisor here, right? I think this is a very interesting topic, and even if you look at just 2020 with everybody working from home remotely, and we've also seen a number of XSS type attacks with the malicious actors really taking more advantage of people working from home. And I think as the adoption also moved towards more around the cloud-based technology, organizations enabling web capabilities for their end users to log in and do interactions. I think there's an aspect where that fast adoption has also enabled the capabilities where security potentially, was left out to a point. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these elements around improper development, improper enablement of checking to ensure the cross-site scripting capabilities are checked, validated. So I think, to me, that's a key thing. And, as we move towards the world of everything, internet enabled, it is very critical that these loopholes are addressed. Obviously, for me, very interested to see how a solution like Cloudentity can help drive that, but also coming from an access management background and being involved in a lot of projects and conversations with customers in the past around how can access management sort of tie back and how does that whole piece work, not only from a front end cross-site scripting perspective, but how can sort of the API-based authorizations capabilities can really help lock some of those gaps.
Absolutely, and well put together. I think, Ketan, one of the things that you and I also spoke about is, when you think about cross-site scripting and you think about all of the different hands that go into creating web client-facing applications, it reminds us of that saying that you and I adhere to, that security is not the one sort of domain of an organization. Regardless whether you have a digital footprint, security is part of the organization, period. It's not siloed to one particular department. And I'm really interested in seeing how best practices can get translated into the web dev team, into, for example, folks that are managing admin credentials, so on and so forth. So looking forward to seeing how the Cloudentity solution scales vertically across a platform. With that said, Nathanael, I met you at the opening talk show. We had a few laughs. I warned you about this session. It's time for the challenge statement. But before I dive into it, Nathanael, can you tell us a little bit about Cloudentity and your approach and emphasis on access and identity management when it comes to addressing vulnerabilities in general? Nathanael?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity. I am not from Ajax, which, I mean, I think that's such a funny, town name, particularly because it's a very commonly exploited manner of doing asynchronous JavaScript, which often gets cross-site scripting vulnerability. So it's like, this is, the ultimate triangulation almost. All that being said, so Cloudentity approaches vulnerabilities and access management as kind of a singular thing. So one of our fundamental goals has been, how do we start to clean up the differences between development, IAM, and cyber? Because right now those all operate almost in their own, unique tranches. Developers don't know OAuth and don't know access management, and they certainly don't know cyber. And there's no cross-pollination or real orchestration between them unless you go and send it out to, a SOAR or a SIM, and then your reactive time is incredibly long. I think is a fair way to say it. So how can we start to make more intelligent authorization decisions? Second part of that is looking at exactly what's in the transaction, right? And when I say what's in the transaction and warranting that towards cross-site scripting, I've got a client, right? It's a web client, but it could be an OAuth client, and often is an OAuth client at this point in time. I've got an application or service. That service is typically composed of, APIs that are either calling internal services or external services, and I've got data going across the wire, right? So I've got three different things that I need to think about securing, and this is, all fundamental to, that zero trust concept. And I hate to throw that nomenclature in there, but it's bandied about so much that you almost have to use it at this juncture. Right. So I've got these three different things that need to authenticate and authorize each other. Right. And I need to really rethink what authorization is. So authorization for the last, 2 decades has been, what can I do in an application, right? RBAC, ABAC, PBAC, and that's still important. So I don't want to get away from that, particularly as we think about privileged or admin users. But it's also been turning into, well, what can an application know about me? When I think about privacy, CCPA, GDPR, Canadian privacy law, and also what can an application share about me? And that's really where it fundamentally gets very interesting in relation to cross-site scripting. So if there's a malicious, either a stored or reflective style attack, should that application actually have permission to share via an API out to a third party or out to another service, right, that data about me? And we're going to, during the course of this discussion, we're going to get heavy into some of the intricacies of OAuth, right? And looking at the newer OAuth standards that are designed to replace deprecated things like implicit flow, using PICT, using status, things of that nature. And how they, there's already some great features that are built out into the open standards bodies that are meant to address this. The problems really are is how do we get these features down to the developers? How do we get developers to adopt the pieces that are already out there? And in doing so, how do we actually automate? How do we make this more simple for them? And then layer it with how are we actually sharing data to the service? Are we getting consent? Are we getting privacy? Is it encrypted, or is it at least encoded, right? And then how can it be decoded? How can it be shared, et cetera? And all of those are fundamental, right, to how are we building these applications, but they're also fundamental to how can developers easily adopt identity and access management to make it very simple for them to adhere to the best practices without having to be OAuth experts.
Fantastic, Nathaniel. And there's a lot to unpack when it comes to cross-site scripting, but small progress is still progress. And to those organizations that are perhaps hearing this for the first time or haven't yet dabbled deep into it, let me remind you again that there is an opportunity here to start on a path of secure DevOps, keeping in mind some of the revelations we're going to have right now about cross-site scripting. Now, before I jump into this challenge statement, and I'm cautious of time here, Graeme, if I can ask you, because I've seen one question come in, and I'd like you to just unpack this very quickly if you can for our audience, and then Nathaniel, you will enter into the hot seat. So Captain Barrie, if I can ask you, can you help our audience understand, as you and I both know, persistent attacks, DOM-based attacks, what are the different kind of cross-scripting attacks that our audience should be aware of, and what do they mean to an organization? If you can take a quick stab at that, Graeme.
In the past, I've used the examples, or when customers or at workshops or what have you, when they ask me, what's an XSS attack, or I always say, well, primarily in the early days of web, but it's still up there, like you mentioned with the OAuth, SQL injection and XSS. And SQL injection was to attack the platform itself, and XSS is to use the platform to attack the user.
Yep.
And it's just finding a door into the platform itself or the application to inject some code to then infect the users. And it could be scraping data, it could be collecting PII, like Nathaniel said, or getting command and control malware on a system to launch further attacks.
And I think what's also really important to understand here is about how overt or even covert some of these attack modules may be. So in some cases, they're hidden within feedback forms. In some cases, it's triggered by a particular action that somebody takes on a website. At the end of the day, you meet the target either at the front door or you meet them in the elevator, as they say, within the website environment itself. And that creates for a very, very tricky terrain to travel through. So with that said, Nathaniel, I'm going to put you on the hot seat now and present a situation to you and ask you to walk us through how you would deal with this challenge. Let's imagine that you've got an enterprise that's starting off a new web-based application for any particular kind of service. They've got in-house DevOps practitioners. They've got some that are outsourced as well. They've got data scientists sitting locally, data scientists that are offshored as well. They've got a team around DevOps that sits within their environment, but they're also interacting with third-party vendors. From a cross-site scripting perspective, how would you get them started? And what would be the main protocols and advice you would walk them through from a Cloudentity and an access management perspective to ensure that they're lowering the risk when it comes to XSS attacks? Nathaniel, for the next 10 odd minutes, the floor is all yours. And I'm going to invite Graeme and Ketan to start making some notes and jotting down some questions, because I know I will have a couple. Nathaniel, over to you, sir.
Sure. All right. So let's just start with the fundamentals, right? And that would be TLS everywhere, right? Making sure that at least your pipes connecting to your new application are secure, right? And this has been bandied about since about 2012, I think, is when Google really started saying we need to have TLS everywhere. So that's the simple one. The next simple one is TLS ciphers, right? And I'll just put those all into their own bucket. as we kind of take another step deeper, right, we need to start thinking about JWKs, right, and making sure you're using long keys for the JWKs, as well as periodic. Sorry, go ahead. Was there a question?
No, please carry on.
Oh, sorry about that. As well as periodic JWK rotation. Just making sure that the keys that are there are being treated appropriately, rotated. Third thing, and these are just fundamental static code reviews. Fourth thing would be secure cookies, using something that's totally inforgeable, making sure that you're validating it via HMAC. And these are all things that your development team, as well as your DevOps team, should be able to handle without any trouble, right? And this would just be the absolute floor, the bare minimum of what you're going to accomplish. Now, as we take one step deeper and say, hey, we are actually worried about our data. We've got sensitive data going to this application. We're integrating with partners. Maybe we have a B2B2C, or even we're just layering on top different SaaS services. Maybe we're just doing an authentication or a post out to Twilio. Well, now we need to start thinking about the client-server relationship, right? And as I mentioned earlier, OAuth has become essentially that fundamental integration pattern for how is my client going to talk to the service. And when I say client, in this case, it could be a mobile application, could be an API-driven application, could be a web application, is going to talk back to my service and then use what's called an authorization server, right? An OAuth authorization server as part of that conversation to guide both the client authentication, meaning something like client credential flow, an authentication code grant, and then authorization of data via either scopes or grants that are allowed to be accessed by the client on the service. And so if we unpack that a little bit more, as we mentioned, there's two major types. Well, there's more than two, but there's two of the most macro types of cross-site scripting, right? Stored cross-site scripting. This is where you might somebody inserts a comment, and this is a very common use case that has a link out to a malicious site that automatically loads and is called via an HTTP call or sometimes an API call for the next user that loads it. And typically they're trying to do one of three things, right? They're trying to do a malware installation for like a distributed command and control network. They might be trying to insert a browser type keylogger, or they're trying to do a session and cookie capture. The second major one is that reflected cross-site scripting, which I think has been mentioned several times already. And again, it's about data compromise, right? How can the attacker start to leverage the browser data, the header data, the HTTP header data, and any cookie and session data again? And so, fundamentally, cross-site scripting, if it's not a command and control or malware installation attack, is about compromising data. So now the question starts to become, well, how do we start to do a better job of authorizing, back to my original point, what data gets down to that client application, how that data is being used, what data that client's giving the service to know about it, and how that data is going to actually be shared. And so that's really where we start to think about how we can start to use use OAuth the way it was designed, and use the standards, the open standards, to protect against cross-site scripting. Right. So when we think about cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgeries, what's happening? We're trying to inject an authorization response into that user's browser. We're going to redirect the victim's browser in a way, right, to either a crafted authorization response or to a different service, and use that to point back to the OAuth client, or use that to point back to either a different OAuth authorization service, or even confuse the authorization service that the client's already designed to use. And so when we start to use things like Pixie, excuse me, or nonces, right, now we start to give ourselves, our developers as well as ourselves, a much better way to protect against either these redirect style attacks, these replay attacks, these reflect attacks, and ensure that not only is TLS being used, not only are the tokens being signed appropriately, either via an HMAC or via a commonly rotated JWK, but I can protect against that injected code, because the code is bound to a code challenge, or the code is bound to a nonce, right? So I do a much better job at saying this code can only be used in this manner, and in doing so, I'm starting to protect the client against other people trying to infiltrate that authorization service and reshare that data. So as we kind of take that one step further, so I keep on hearing somebody talk. So is there a question?
Unless it's all the thoughts rolling through my head that are reaching you in a telepathic environment. Nothing here. Keep on rocking and rolling. You're hitting some
Okay.
very interesting points, and I'm looking forward to some more questions. Keep rocking it.
Okay, sorry, I'll just keep on rocking then. So in this case, right, we can use the Pixie, which has a an encrypted essentially nonce, but in this case it's not a nonce. We can use a nonce itself, and we can use states, all things that are built directly into the OAuth and OIDC frameworks. Right. So if we look at the nonce is hashed. It's sent in as part of what we call the code challenge parameter down to the authorization service. Right. The token request, the client sends the nonce back to the code verifier, right, to make sure that it matches. And there's no opportunity for a third party to compromise the data that's being sent over. Right. That becomes very, very important. So even if I have a reflective attack where I'm trying to redirect you to a different authorization service, to a different external third party malicious service, well, what's happening is saying, oh, I'm looking at this code challenge. You can't verify that. We're not going to allow that part of the transaction to happen. So very, very powerful way to start building against, to start protecting against cross-site scripting. Now, as we start to think about, okay, OAuth is this governing framework that we can use, different pieces of to protect against, the more common variants. I also want to start thinking about how can I control data that's getting down to the client or even being received from the client, right? And this is kind of a next step. And as I think about, what is the sensitive data that's going across the wire? Is it financial data? Is it PCI data? Is it PHI data? Is it PII data? Right? The question starts to become, how was it shared? What was the intent? And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, is the intent-based authorization patterns that are really being facilitated by both the OAuth FAPI standard as well as the open banking standards, in making sure that you understand not just who the user is, not just what the service is and what the data is, but when it's used in this capacity, how is that data meant to be shared? Was that data consented to being shared? And then where can I authorize the release of that data via, again, OAuth authorization grants back to the service or back from the service down to the client? And that's where things really start to get very, very interesting, because you can start to layer on top of very rich authorization constructs beyond your basic OAuth, or even beyond your basic OAuth fully fulfilled to protect against cross-site scripting, to actually start controlling how data is moving through your enterprise.
So Nathanael, I just want to work with that a little bit. And I think you've provided a very neat context. And given that today we are focusing on the financial services piece, I have two questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Graeme and Ketan. And I saw both of them staring very intently at the screen, probably wondering about how I maintain this hair. I will let you know how it works. But gentlemen, let's dive into it. I have two questions. I'm going to dive into them, and Nathanael, I'll bring them directly to you. Given that we're talking about financial services sector, now, can you comment a little bit about XSS prevention rules? How many types of rules do you recommend need to be in place? Because you've listed off quite a lot from a checklist perspective, but as we know, nothing is set in stone, it's set in jello. How can XSS prevention rules be utilized from an access management perspective?
Yes. So what I tried to iterate was, fundamental development processes at the beginning, right? And then fundamental service identity and OAuth-based processes towards the middle, and then ended with policies, authorization policies around how data is going to flow, right? So if we take each one of those buckets, the fundamental development processes, ranging from, again, TLS down to making sure that your cross-origin resource sharing only comes from, trusted sources, right? That is entirely in your development bucket. The second piece, right, which is how to use OAuth in the way it was designed, using all of the intrinsic features to protect against cross-site scripting. That's kind of a combination, right, between your identity access management platform. A lot of them don't support the advanced ones. I'll be frank with you. Or as we just saw, there was a 0-day in one of the major ones very, very recently, as somebody was probing actually for OAuth deficiencies. And so a lot of that actually has to do with the vendor that you have in place. And unfortunately, that's a little bit harder to discuss. Because you want to make sure you are supporting the latest, most advanced standards, and you're supporting, massive scale. The third one, right, which is these authorization control rules and and whether they're privacy based or you're really just getting down to fine-grained authorization of how data is moving in between the authorization server, the service, and the client. Those are fundamental to what does the client actually need. Do we want to propagate rich tokens, which is what most organizations are doing today? It has potentially the full user record down to those clients or down to those different services, because all that does is create honeypots, essentially, right? Creates services that have far too much data, and I guess I like to correlate it with CO2, right? For the last decade, we've been being told data is the new oil, data is the new oil, data is the new oil. But as we misuse the new oil, right, we get global warming, right? We're not constraining how we're consuming it. We're not constraining how that data is flowing. So being able to use fine-grained authorization to do much better authorization capabilities and centralize those of how is data getting down to my different services and how is data being exchanged between clients and services, right? That becomes the fundamental aspect. Is, as a CIO, I want to know where that data came from. I want to know where that data went. And then also how that data is being shared. So how do I build these policies to constrain it? Now, your original question is how many policies or how many rules do I need? It's almost an impossible answer. And what I mean by that is the rules are going to be dependent upon the data flowing or upon your development processes, right? And upon how you are doing things like sharing of data in between services.
You know what, I asked about rules and you threw it right back at me and said rules are meant to be broken. And I absolutely see where you're coming from. And I think this is where the partnership with Cloudentity then begins to take form. And it's a process when you start looking at how to apply access management to address the XSS issues that we're uncovering thus far. I'm going to ask a second question. And again, I'm going to bring it back to the financial services and the banking side of things. When I think about DevOps within especially with the example that I showed, when I think about DevOps within a banking environment, if you're building, for example, in a previous session, we talked about digital wallets. If you're building digital ecosystems for remittances, for example, as one institution, while I might be building a native solution entirely in-house, I'm still dependent on a lot of third-party vendors. I'm dependent on APIs that might allow me to evaluate a stable coin against a treasury. I am dependent on APIs that show me currency fluctuations, for example, Fixer.io being a very good example of items where I can get additional data sets. Are you suggesting that third-party integrations, are probably a high risk? And if so, what are some best practices that you would adopt in this situation to guide my institution with how do we interact with third-party applications, especially when we're making API calls? Nathanael?
So, I mean, fundamentally, the more people with access to sensitive data or access to sensitive services increases the risk, right? The most secure service is one that's not online, right? That's kind of been cybersecurity day one. So if I want to reduce risk, third parties, create more risk. It's why we're spending so much time doing vendor assessments in the industry, et cetera, et cetera. Now, fundamentally, we live in a partner consumer-driven ecosystem. So there's no way to isolate yourselves. And if you do, your digital transformation platforms and programs are probably moot. So, the world is in a B2B2C or B2P2C construct, period. Every new application, whether you think about you being a B2B2C or B2P2C, you are a B2B2C once you start sharing data. So whether I'm sharing data by authenticating at Okta, sharing data by sending something off to Twilio or to Salesforce, all of a sudden I have created a B2B2C data sharing environment. Now, fundamental to that, right, is how am I going to authenticate and authorize not just my end user, not just my internal services, but my partner services as well. And this is what open banking has done phenomenally well, which is lay out a framework, right, based upon OAuth FAPI, which is, definitively the gold standard for API security, and requires things like mutual TLS between different services, between client and services, signed JOTs, right, as we pass data back and forth, right, usage of Pixie, for example, and then it also gives very robust requirements around how are we going to onboard net new services into our ecosystem. So there's dynamic client registration, which is part of the OAuth standard. However, open banking did a fantastic job of strengthening it using SSA, secure software assertion. So making sure that I have a signed statement from either a central authority or a trusted third party that I am going to accept data or I'm going to accept this service into my open banking ecosystem. right? And then they've used that to cross-pollinate between what's called third-party providers and share data between my host bank and aggregators like mint.com, for example.
And I think what's really interesting I know there are quite a few folks with a DevSecOps background and watching this session, also those with a dev background. You got to do all of this in a couple of seconds because you cannot interfere with the user experience. People want to transfer money. I always accept money transfers. Cash is king, though. You want it to happen in a couple of seconds. And to go through this whole validation process real quick is an interesting process in and of itself. And there is a question that's come in related to this, which Nathanael, I'll come to very, very shortly. Ketan, I want to come to you very quickly because as Nathanael was talking about this aspect of digital certificates, I thought about something that you said some time ago during our tech talk with each other. We said trust but verify, digital certificates, blockchain, all within your area of operation. Ketan, what are some questions that you'd like to ask Nathanael based on his first 15 minutes in response to the challenge? Floor is yours.
Thank you. So again, and I think I think you did a great job of explaining some of the challenges and stuff, and I think it's great. But I think one key thing that's also important, right, is that I think if you're building something from scratch, yes, I can move towards adopting TLS and adopting a lot of these new capabilities and stuff. But if I'm an existing web app, which is still using a lot of native stuff, how do organizations sort of move from where they are today to sort of becoming more secure to ensure that they're leveraging some of these key capabilities, right? So how would a platform like Cloudentity sort of help you and drive to ensure you are adopting some of the new capabilities from a standards perspective and also enabling the security that you are looking for, not only for yourself as an organization, but also allowing that from an end user perspective?
Thanks. Good question. And so, fundamentally to that is you have to be able to work with the older applications, like to your point, and the older application infrastructures, even while you're adopting, Kubernetes, service mesh, functions, things of that nature. And this is something that we, as a company, actually learned a little bit the hard way. Meaning, we released for Istio in 2019, right? Nobody even knew what Kubernetes was at that point in time, and we're like, "Hey, look, we're ready to go." And then they realized, oh, you know what? We actually need to backport. We need to backport a long ways. I mean, we're not going to backport to RACF and COBOL. Don't get me wrong, but we had to backport to your traditional API gateways, for example, or have a standalone authorization service that can sit directly in front of a legacy monolithic app. And that's one of the really neat things here, right? Is even as we're kind of moving backwards a little bit, and I say that with, some quotes up, I guess would be a fair way to do it. We're also, by giving a very unique workload and service-based identity to your different services, even as you're decomposing your monolith into microservices and building, API first environments, now we're tying that identity and we're tying policies and we're tying OAuth configuration and scopes directly to the endpoints. So those endpoints can pop up essentially anywhere, meaning it could show up in GCP this morning, could be in Azure this afternoon, could be in AWS this evening. And regardless of where that service emerges, it's going to be protected in the exact same manner because we're externalizing, right, the OAuth configuration, we're externalizing some of the integration patterns, we're externalizing obviously the authorization policies away from the service itself. And that's one of also the big boons for developers, right? So today, if I say, hey, developer A, love you, but I want you to do these three rules-based policies into your platform. Well, what's going to happen? They're going to hard code it in their language of choice, right? And then in 2 weeks, right, they're going to leave on a different project, or maybe even leave the firm, God forbid, right? And the CISO is going to say, well, what happened? What do we do with that privacy data? What do we do with that authorization context? What do we do with these different constructs that they just built? Oh, they're hard coded in the application. What do I have to do now? I have to find a new developer. I have to maybe decompile the application. Hopefully they have the source code, but we've seen some pretty crazy things, as I'm sure you have. And then they have to go and say, okay, it looks like they did X, Y, and Z. Well, regulatory bodies have changed, or there's a cross-site scripting problem that's in their main code. What do we do, right? Oh, we have to recompile, redeploy, et cetera, incredibly expensive, which is why we're seeing, from Verizon Business, it takes something like 270 days, I think was their latest one, to remediate vulnerabilities. Now, by externalizing it, putting a lightweight proxy directly in front of, the service, and again, monolithic or function, doesn't matter, itself, we're able to rapidly update, rapidly patch, rapidly clean up a lot of the problems, the underlying fundamental flaws that might be in that application, as well as give a graphical representation back to your CIO, CISO of what authorization, how data is moving, what policies are enabled, how that application is being protected, what governance is wrapped around OAuth, the OAuth configuration, et cetera, et cetera.
You know what? I really like the way you've tackled this challenge. Speed without direction is very, very dangerous, and I think you've listed off a whole bunch of controls, and you've gone through them quickly, but you've shown how Cloudentity goes through a process of directing and working with the client through the process. And I really, really appreciate this. And to our audience and to all of those who are answering challenge statements in the days to come, this approach Nathanael has taken, which doesn't just include the vendor coming in and parachuting in and leaving, but becoming part of that journey, is extremely important. So Nathanael, keep rocking it the way you are, because there's certainly a lot that I'm ascertaining from this. Nathanael, I believe you're based out in the US, so since I've got everybody else in the Durham region or close to, I'm going to hop on his private jet. Mr. Barrie, I'm going to hop on your jet from the US to Peterborough. And now, I know you're smiling, but I know that there is a sword that's about to be unleashed, and you've got a couple of questions. So Graeme, the floor is yours. Ask away.
Yeah, I'm looking at this from more of a data management medium-sized business, or less than the financial services side. It pertains to it, but it's something that I've picked up in a couple sessions today, and Ketan mentioned it earlier, was the work from home and everybody, jumping on cloud apps. And we know a lot of employees look to apps to make their job easier that were outside of the scope of the organization. And I'm wondering, from a management perspective, how do you implement your tools to manage the policies that you mentioned earlier? I'm not a developer, so full disclosure, I always look at it as an API as, you're just opening the fire hose, and it's just a big plow of data is coming at you, and then it's up to you to filter it and grab what you want. So if employees have the ability to, interconnect these cloud apps so easily now today, how can I implement policies to ensure that the right data is being transmitted between these, and I'm protecting my data?
Mm-hmm. So couple big questions there, and actually I'll probably go through them slowly. So first is, yes, employees are building net new applications, and they can build them incredibly rapidly. I mean, anybody with 30 minutes and, a Postman can actually start to layer together APIs literally in real time. Yep. And whether that's an S3 bucket, going back through an API, AWS API gateway, or something that's much more complex with business logic interwoven into it, right? You need to you have to be able to know what services and APIs you have, right? And that's oftentimes where we actually start with our customers. And what I mean by that is, if I go to a CISO, even at a small SMB or at a large enterprise, 99.9, maybe 4 nines, maybe even 5 nines, if I'm feeling if I'm feeling lucky today, they have no idea what APIs they have going north-south out to their customers, much less east-west between their different BUs, within their Kubernetes clusters, et cetera, et cetera. So fundamental to where we start is being able to map that out. So we plug into your existing API gateways, cross API gateway, cross cloud, cross Kubernetes clusters, and we start to at least give you a catalog, right? You have these APIs that are external facing connected to this IDP. You have these APIs internal facing passing this type of data, or at least spec to pass this type of data with the Open API framework, or the Open API spec, I'm sorry. So being able to build that first gives you like that visibility of what should I attack, right? Second to your question is once you have what you should attack, or what you should address. let's not confuse the aggressor with the defenders, right? What should you address? Well, then you can start looking at and start tagging different data types, right? Is this sensitive data? Is it regulated data? Or is this a wiki that, I don't necessarily care too much about? And starting to be able to then create or reuse policies, because we come with out-of-the-box policy packs wrapped around most of the major industries, whether that's an open banking Brazil, open banking UK, NIST 853 standards, right? They just come, and you can take those, and then you can actually use a very robust delegated administration system. And this is something I think the industry's been lacking. total segue, but humor me for about 30, 40 seconds, right? Is, where we got to from an identity perspective, and this is kind of cross industry, is we had big monoliths that were doing IAM for employees, right? Fantastic. We all of a sudden saw that we needed to do a consumer-based IAM. So we, kind of stapled a few things on top of it that supported OIDC, OAuth. But at the same time, we've created, these giant monolithic Java applications or even giant monolithic SaaS services that really weren't designed to enable the B2B2C or B2P2C world that we're all finding ourselves into once we start layering APIs together. So being able to create policy, right, or inherit policy at the global level that my CISO says, hey, I want to follow NIST 853 letter of the law. Here's the different pieces we want to use. And then a BU that says, I want to enable open banking as a third-party provider. And being able to layer those on top of each other and create policies at the global layer, the BU layer, the application owner layer, the developer layer, and then have the developer be able to use the exact same identity and authorization policies from day 1 of writing code to day 30 or day 60 of releasing code, right? That fundamentally changes the entire way that your business works with their development teams, who's working with security, right? Because right now, what we find is that security and identity in particular is paralyzing digital transformation, because they can't move fast enough. They don't have the necessary data models. They don't have the ability to do distributed policy decision point, adopt distributed services ad infinitum, right? So being able to enable your developers by externalizing this away from their code, or avoiding that hard coding piece, and then make it consumable via a UI of, here's the graphical representation of not just how your services are connected, not just how the data is moving between your IDPs and your different data stores on those services, but also how the policies look.
Looking at your response, Nathanael, I will say this, and looking at how Graeme has been responding and making a few gestures, it seems like you've passed the Barrie barometer of a really good solution. So I think you're definitely going down the right path here, Nathanael. I just want to alert you, we've got about 7 to 8 more minutes and then a few questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. So I'm going to let Graeme and Ketan just take a few moments to compose their thoughts and come back with maybe 1 or 2 more questions. But Nathanael, I'm going to bring this to you because it did come into me by direct message, and I'm just going to reword it just a little bit. And this has to do with testing. Now, you and I both know when it comes to testing, tests are not meant to break you, but they're meant to make you. But from a DevOps perspective, and when it comes to testing, from an access managed standpoint, that you follow the OAuth rules, that you've got the right protocols in place, how does Cloudentity propose going through the testing process that I need to go through before I validate my product for market? Nathanael?
Oh, that's a hard one. So we are not a SAST or a DAST. I want to be very clear about that. You need to maintain and manage your own SAST and DAST tools for actually testing the code that you're writing. Now, as we start thinking, one step beyond that, in terms of looking at the interconnections between you, your partners, your SaaS services you're consuming, that's where Cloudentity starts the rubber starts hitting the road. And then as we start looking at, how are those services configured, meaning an OAuth client credential flow, authorization code grant flow, Pixie flow, whatever it may be, being able to normalize what that looks like, and then wrap a layer of governance around it, tying again the IDP to the service identity to rich policies to OAuth configuration, right? That's where we fit in. And so when we look at from a testing perspective, I've got a couple big things that have to happen. So one, obviously regular penetration testing, like we do it internally, but you should be doing it to your applications as well, as we just saw, in the 0 day I mentioned a little bit earlier. Second part is testing the policies. And what I mean by that is not that the policies won't work, but making sure the policies are working in the way you want them to work. And that kind of translates into, within my open API spec, do I have first name, last name? Am I releasing first name, last name, and date of birth down to the service, right? Let's make sure that we're constraining how data is flowing so applications only get what they need to function. And instead of using this push model where we send all the data everywhere, let's use a pull model where the applications use an API as they're being built or where they're being registered to say, I need these data elements, and this is what's going to come over in my JOT or in my OAuth access token. And in doing so, right, we're starting to constrain what can be done or what can be compromised. Sorry, is what I'm trying to say. The second part is and this is something we just do out of the box, and we didn't get into it, but is single use access, and refresh tokens, right? So no longer have long-lived tokens, but moving into transactional tokens. And this is really fundamental because if I compromise that token, I either have to go back to the OAuth service with my refresh token to get a new one because it's no longer valid if I try to do a token replay or a session replay attack. So being able to move into a much higher volume of token minting and start to use single-use tokens for transactions. And it might be that token 1 is for transferring a balance down to the service. Token 2 is for updating my last name, right? So being able to get very, very fine-grained in what's coming across in those tokens and start to use single-use tokens to accomplish that. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, and I think the emphasis on single-use tokens is particularly intriguing, and I may come back to that based on a question that has already come in. But just as you asked us to humor you for a bit, allow me to humor you. Just imagine the same situation which I just mentioned about a bank developing its own application. For whatever reason, imagine I was the CEO of the bank. God help that bank. But let's say one of the top things that I know is when it comes to security, especially when it comes to items that are web-based, which are client-facing. Sometimes the onus of responsibility also lies on the users of these applications. Is there anything from a cross-site scripting perspective that Cloudentity could do to help me inform my users on some best practices? How do you help me with mediating that relationship with clients who are only expecting instant services and immediate access to their finances? Nathanael?
That's a great question.
Once in a while, you know what, it happens, and you know what, it's the energy I'm getting from Graeme and Ketan. You were going so smooth, so fine. I know. Had to throw that curveball in.
Yeah. So we are not engaging with the end users themselves typically, and let me caveat that a little bit. Unless something like consent is required, right? So as we look at the next generation of services and the next generation of companies, privacy is a fundamental requirement at this point, right? And this doesn't lend itself that well to cross-site scripting, although we'll tie it back in just a second. So privacy is becoming a brand differentiator. Apple just made $1 trillion bet on their whole company that people are going to buy us because of privacy. I don't know if anybody saw their latest commercial, right, with all the cookies following them and saying that privacy is fundamental. You want to be able to control what a cookie, what third-party services know about you. Now, as part of that, again, map that back to controlling of data and the different types of authorization. So as a user, I want to give you as little data as possible. I only want you to have the data that's required for that service. So maybe I registered, with a social login from Facebook or Google or even, GitLab, for example. Now, as I go and deploy my service or as I go and kind of conduct my transaction, well, you might need my last name, you might need my date of birth, you might need my account number, you might need additional data sets about me. And I want to be consenting during those processes, not at the very beginning in a giant registration flow, and certainly not at the very end, after you already consumed my data without me knowing it. I want to consent during the course of the transaction or course of series of transactions to what data you're allowed to use, when you're going to use it, how you're going to use it, who you might share it with, as I am going through the transaction. And that is what we do, right? So when it comes down to that end user customer journey, being able to control data, move into what we call progressive consent to data when it's being used, be able to have fine-grained authorization around the consent, meaning I want to say that you can use my last name or my account number or this transaction ID once. You can share it to a third party, but only this third party, or it's only valid for 30 days. I don't want to have to come back and clean up the mess that organizations are creating with my PII. I want to be able to control it right at the front door. And then if you're invalid, if you're not treating it appropriately, I want to see the government fine you. I mean, it's talking rather boisterously, but that's really how it should, the use case of how it should act. That's what we're seeing in Europe. And I'm expecting that's what we'll see more and more of in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, how it goes, right? Once these policies take shape in Europe and the US, it tends to seep into the Canadian context as well. You know what, we have about 7 minutes left, and I'm going to say this. You've been on the hot seat for about 32 minutes. Somebody give this man a samosa and a lemonade, because you've really dissected each question extremely detailed and a real poster child for those who are coming up for the next few challenges over the next one session later today and then the next 4 days. So I'm very, very excited about the approach that you've taken. Ketan and Graeme, I'm going to bring you into the conversation and then we'll come to a quick soft landing. Ketan, let's start off with you. Now, Ketan, in your work, especially when you're doing passwordless authentication, when you've adopted some blockchain models as well, how does, based on what you've heard, how does the Cloudentity stack sort of work with your model as well? And do you see it as beneficial, Ketan?
No, and I think this is very beneficial, right? Because the hat that I wear today, right, is when we focus on passwordless authentication. So there's sort of that one aspect that Nathanael sort of talked about around, this is my identity. How can I assert my identity as I go through these things? But I think when you look at the back end aspect of things from a API authorization perspective, and when you're looking things from an open banking side of things, right? So when I, for example, logging into an open banking system without a password, that's great. But now once that information is shared, how is it controlled between those different systems interacting from an open banking perspective? That's one element. But then as I move into and let's say execute certain transactions or wire transfers, how is that API policy kicking in? And then how does that push back to me as an end user to say, hey, are you allowing this transaction to go through? Or, Ketan is transferring $10,000 to Ali for a great job he's doing. So,
Accepted, no questions asked. US
right.
dollars,
So,
please.
yeah. So, as a user, am I consenting those transfer of funds, right? So I think this is where I think a solution like this really comes into play. When you sort of connect the dots, it's, there's the authentication piece, which is important, but then you need to tie authentication and authorization together to really close the envelope and seal the envelope when it comes to tying the two together to really create that seamless, I would say, security, but also create that seamless user experience that is needed for the end users today. Because as you mentioned, everybody wants to come in within a matter of seconds, execute these transactions, but as an end user, I don't want to know what's happening behind the scenes. I'm expecting you as an organization to ensure that all these secure elements are built in. So I think as an organization, you need to start focusing on saying, okay, well, how can we leverage these combined technologies and capabilities to really secure ourselves as an organization, but also enable our users who are going to become your loyal customers, because you don't only you care about them, their security, but also you're providing a much simpler, intuitive, capabilities for them to execute these various transactions that they have more control over, and they have more trust.
No, and I agree with you, right? As we've said before, right? Alone you can go very fast, together we can go very far. And this approach of how you can partner with a particular vendor, or in this case, a partner really with like such as Cloudentity, really helps you understand how you need to build your security posture by working with multiple types of solution providers. And I got that sense too, listening to Nathanael, that the door of opportunity to engage and partner is very much open with Cloudentity, and that's an extremely important posture to have as you're building your security ecosystem. Last question to Captain Barrie, and then we'll come to a soft landing. Mr. Barrie, you are the CEO of Netmechanics. You are a VC, so you're a member of our advisory board as well. Done a lot of great work. Your Netmechanics garage is where everybody goes for a cybersecurity tune-up. Let me ask you this: from a training and a tools perspective, how do you see the ability to work with Cloudentity? Do you see it as an opportunity to raise awareness programs? Do you see it as an opportunity to create training modules around XSS? What have you taken as real nuggets? Speaking of nuggets, and I haven't had lunch, what do you take as real nuggets from this session?
Yeah, first off, take my money. The way you describe the policies and being able to go from executive to CISO to CIO to business units down all the way to the developers, I see that as a major tool for education throughout the organization. And if you can educate all of those levels of the organization to, the data flow that is going on and the security around the data that's being flowed, and have it in a, like you said, a graphical interface that you can take to the C-suite and say, here's where our data is, here's where it's going, and here's where your risks are. and let's start tightening it up by just turning some dials and putting in some policies. And I think that that's the best way to approach it. With the organizations I'm working with, I have all those layers, and it is a challenge to communicate to all those different layers because you have to speak their language. And this sounds like it's the tool to do it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And Nathanael, I'm sure you get connected with Graeme and have further conversations. We have come to the last minute of our discussion. So before I bring us to a close, I will say this, that there were a couple of other questions that were directed directly at me and some questions provided to me in advance. And Nathanael, these are items to think about, and I would be more than happy to conduct a future session. So I do invite you to speak to the team at siberXchange and siberX to see what's possible. A couple of questions else that had come in was around budgets for Cloudentity services, timelines for development, especially as agile development and with the rate of digital transformation, with DevOps, 2 years of work happening now in 2 months. How do you ensure that you can move quickly from an access management perspective? There was also a question talking about open source libraries, especially languages that are they're predominantly open source, and how do you actually operate and how do you make decisions on the languages that you choose when you're doing DevOps? And also some questions about how, really, for lack of a better word, an excessive access management approach to cross-scripting might also hinder user experiences. So a lot of questions that have come in, quite a few DevOps folks that were on. I appreciate it. You can catch the session on demand starting next week. But Nathanael, thank you. Graeme, Ketan, as always. Here's what I will say in conclusion of this session. If Nathanael, if you were defending, or this was your thesis or dissertation defense, I'd be calling you Dr. Coffing after this. So Nathanael, very, very well done. Thank you again. And to our audience, I do encourage you to stay on. In the next little while, there will be a session conducted by eCentire with Trish Villanueva and Mark Sangster, where they'll be tackling the aspects of remote work and banking and some of the security concerns that emerge and are likely to continue to emerge as we move into the quote-unquote new normal. So once again, on behalf of the advisory the advisory board members, Graeme Barrie and Ketan Kapadia, as well as Nathanael from Cloudentity, thank you all for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you in about an hour for the final session of the day.